Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. This hour, we're going to be speaking to Nate Riddle about his new book, Lone Star Saucers, Searching for UFOs in Texas. But this hour of Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading our free 50-page guide. So if you've been thinking about changing careers and becoming a medical intuitive counselor, or a certified energy medicine practitioner, you can start your education today at the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. It's also brought to you by soulhealer.com, which has information about all the products and services I offer, lots of articles, tons of good stuff. Please do stop by and visit. And if you do, and I'm just putting this out, so we've almost hit 4,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and I just want to go over the top. So if you're listening to the show on YouTube, give us that thumbs up, okay? All right, thanks. So let me tell you a little bit about Nate and get him on the air. Nate Riddle studied anthropology and psychology while attending the University of North Texas, where he was had a focused interest on cultural studies, field methods, and folklore in particular. His love of the unknown inspired him to share that passion and search for answers with readers, both believers and skeptics, to entertain as well as spur thought and conversation about these enduring mysteries. So the author of Lone Star Saucers. Please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Nate Riddle. Hey, Nate, how are you?
Hey, Rita. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm just excited to have you because I know this is your second book, and for some reason, which I don't know why, you never came on to talk about your ghosty book, but you're here now talking about saucers, so it's all good.
It's all good. It worked out.
Yeah. So how did you get interested? I mean, it says that you studied anthropology and psychology, and I know you have a book about ghosts, and now you have this one about flying saucers in Texas. How did you get into this whole alternative field of study and adventure?
Yeah, no, I think like a lot of people, I just, I grew up as a kid just in, I was probably one of those kids that was drawing, kind of random things and daydreaming a little too much just growing up, and just had that big imagination and just always kind of thought, there's a little more than what I can just see and touch, that it would be nice to know that there's something else to life than death and taxes. And I think that's probably where it started. I was always that kid that, my parents had like a little play set in the backyard, but I wanted to go find a lot of old pieces of wood and build a fort, so I just wanted to go and do my own thing. And I grew up, really watching shows like reruns of like In Search Of and Arthur C. Clarke's, Mysterious Universe and Unsolved Mysteries. And I think when I was a kid, it made a really big impression on me to see these really well-polished shows that had either very well spoken and or very well written kind of segments about these unknown mysteries. And like you said, I mean, it could be haunted places, it could be UFOs and aliens, it could be the Bermuda Triangle. But I think it really caught my imagination at an early age that there were adults out there that they entertained these ideas and they were interested in getting to the bottom of these questions and trying to find answers. And so the older I got and went into college, I was like, I've always been interested in people. And I think like you, as an author, that it's nice to be able to write stories and do something that you hope is entertaining and interesting to others. And I never really wanted to change people's minds, if they're dead set, ghosts don't exist, or UFOs and aliens, that there's nothing to it. It's a bunch of, phony baloney. I really wanted to write something that showed my passion and, shared, I think, a lot of the same thoughts and feelings and beliefs of others in a way that, intrigued people who are a little on the fence or just thought, nah, there's really nothing to this, and maybe surprise them by the information that is out there. And then for people who really do believe in that and they're open to it, I think there's a fine line. It's, hey, let's make sure that we're using our heads, right? We don't just fall for every story that comes up, because unfortunately in the paranormal supernatural realm, there are a lot of people that want to hoax something just to get attention. There are people that want to misdirect, or they're doing it for whatever their reasons are, and they're not always just purely scientific or just the betterment of mankind's understanding of it. And so I wanted to write something that's fun, it's engaging, and people can share with like-minded people, and maybe someone even in their family or friends that are on the opposite side of the street when it comes to that, in a way that it's entertaining for both.
Well, okay.
And I hope I was able to do it the second time around too. So hopefully I did it right, and it works for both readers.
No, I mean, I really enjoyed your book, so we're going to start digging into it. But, this is your first time on, and so when I have somebody on for the first time, we always kind of do this, who are you and what do you do?
Sure.
And so when you come back on with your next book, don't worry, we won't even be doing this part. We'll just be jumping right into it.
Jump right into it.
We just jump right into it. So, we're talking about Texas, and we're both kind of these history. I want to talk about old stuff. Let's talk about old stuff. So what are some of the earliest reports that you were able to uncover about UFOs in Texas?
Sure. Well, when I am probably like you, when I sit down to write something, the first thing I even think of before I even say I'll do it is there enough here? Is there enough variety and kind of depth that I can take readers along on kind of a journey, right? They're going to start in one place and hopefully end up somewhere else. That's my goal, because there's so many books that are out there that, whether it's UFOs or haunted spots, it's just kind of a travel guide. And I really try to stick away from that. I really want to give someone something that when they're finished reading it, they feel like they've sat right in that room with that person, they've learned something, and they can kind of make their own educated guess, or kind of make their own judgment call on, do I believe that or not? And so UFOs in Texas, I was fairly aware of just the history, and I think I was able to, like you said, really dig in and find some really neat old articles that are out there, old newspaper clippings. But in Texas, reported sightings in just newspapers started in the late 1800s, and even mid 1800s it goes back, where farmers, just kind of locals, mainly in North Texas that I found, and I think that's more just to the newspapers that were there at the time. They reported kind of a glowing disc or, an unusual fast-moving object in the sky. And you look back and there may have been, helium-filled balloons or something like that. There's certainly constellations and planets that people were, just in everyday, day-to-day life, like Samaritan on the street, they weren't really well-versed with that, right? So there were certain things that when they reported it, you could tell, okay, there's no airplanes, there's no jet fighters, there's no advanced military craft up there. So when they said, hey, I saw this, orange glowing disc that, flew 200 miles an hour over my head in broad daylight, the chances are they either completely made it up or they saw something, they passed it on to someone else, and an editor said, let's run it, let's get people talking. And I think that's what was interesting to me, is that, one, it started so long ago, and when I wrote the book about Texas, that's really more from a marketing standpoint. And again, any publisher will say, we really want you to zero in on this target audience. But the title has Texas in it. It really could apply to any state. It could be anywhere in the U.S. It could be something that I think is valuable for people anywhere that are interested in UFOs. And I think what was interesting going back is really starting to look at how these sightings and reports came through over 100 years ago, and you map that to today.
That's the part that I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, and I think you look at yellow journalism, and maybe you're like me, Rita. I think of you watch like old documentaries or old news broadcasts or anything that's just kind of before your time. And to me, I just have this bias, like, well, people always just told the truth back then. That's kind of, they just reported it as they saw it. And today with the internet, I think people are much more aware of the fact that someone just had, some software on their computer. They happen to have like some video while they were out driving around one night, and they decided, hey, I can drop in this, 3D UFO effect and put it on YouTube and just see what happens. And I think people just today know, like, people are sneaky. People have their own reasons. They just want to mess around. And, sometimes some of it's kids, some of it's someone who's trying to kind of say, hey, look at this UFO I saw. And then, a day later say, look how I faked it, and all these people believed it and I suckered them into it. And I think you go back in time and you read a lot of those reports and you go, even if 80 or let's say 90% of them were made up, there's still a core there of unique sightings. And when you see them over the years and reports, they all have a very similar tone and they have a very similar recap of what that event was. And it's not very different than what we see today and what people report today.
There were a couple of things that I found interesting in some of those reports. One, that they were, not in all of them, but in a couple of them, they were described as like a serpent in the sky or a dragon in the sky, which makes me go immediately to mythological, references like Quetzalcoatl, where when they talk about, the feathered serpent or these serpents, that they might actually be talking about these ships and a trail, through the smoke that they're leaving. And so I thought that added credibility to the whole thing.
And it's no different to me today. You exactly like you mentioned, you go, well, people were seeing dragons in the sky. I mean, they were mistaken. You go, there are videos on YouTube right now from the last year that have flying humanoids in them. And people go, oh, it's just balloons. You're like, well, no, someone's seeing something now, whether it's a balloon or not, or whether it's a drone of some kind. Maybe there is something there that you could explain it in that way. But the fact is, people really saw some of these things and they reported them as they could interpret them. And that's what I found neat. You mentioned flying saucers at the top, and some of the reports were of, discs and ball-shaped objects. And in the book, one of the first reports was really pre-Kenneth Arnold. It was the first time someone likened in a report a flying object to a saucer. Was in Texas, and I thought that was really interesting. Several years ahead of the 40s in Kenneth Arnold's report. But you look at that, and I think that's really interesting to me that at the time people said it looks like a ship with bat wings and a huge engine electric light on the front of it, and it had propellers and it was steam powered and it flew off great distances at high speeds. And people at that time, I think they just didn't have the context. They didn't have the awareness of technology that we do today to really describe those, encounters. And I think we still run into that right now. People go, oh, it was lights, and they appeared and disappeared. And something uniquely unusual, I think, when people try to describe it, I think the ones that are a little more nebulous are the ones I tend to gravitate towards a little bit more, because it's someone they'd never seen anything like it before, and they were really at a loss for how do I interpret this for someone who wasn't there.
In that period, the people that, and you may or may not know because you just have reports, how were the people that made the reports, how was that whole thing accepted? Were those people just seen as being crazy, or do you not have enough data to make any kind of a
I mean, a little bit. I think, going back to the editors of the day, they didn't have these massive newsrooms. It was typically an editor that was just trying to put something, to fill the space. And I think you look at the way they wrote a lot of those, and it would be, Dr. Rita Louise, she, whose reputation is, beyond reproach and hadn't had any drop of liquor that evening, says that after 7:30 on her farm, she saw this. And so a lot of the reports you would see, they were written at least in a way that said, this is really an upstanding individual. This is someone who, here's their occupation. They're a lawyer or whatever the case may be, or a hardworking farmer. They're not prone to exaggerations. They really tried to write it in a way that said, this person is not someone who's pulling your leg, right? This is someone that you should take seriously, and these reports are interesting. I think it just so happens that the readership and the buzz in these areas clearly went up when, hey, this amazing sighting took place, and we've got it on, good word that this is something in the area flying around our skies. Help sell the newspapers. but when they characterize these reports, they are usually very straightforward. I mean, some were kind of tongue in cheek, but those you could tell a little bit easier. But 9 times out of 10, a lot of the way that they reported it was, this is a very straightforward, solid eyewitness, and what they're saying is something that we believe happened. And I think that's interesting of the time. Today you look at UFO sightings, and a lot of times the media is like, did someone see a mothership? We'll find out at 10, and it's ridiculed a bit. And when you look back to a lot of those, it was kind of a different tone that they took at the time.
All right, so now I have to ask you, because I keep posting stuff in the chat room about it, but are you aware that there was a sighting in Houston last week?
Yes, so, I was.
Talk about that. I mean, I'm just sitting here hearing about it, and then they posted video, and I'm like watching it, and I had to turn the sound off because I couldn't hear you. But I just have to make this commentary to the people that are listening. They have this thing, and they have a poll that says, do you believe in extraterrestrial life?
Yep.
And it started off at like 90-something%. And then as time went down, it started going down, 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 down. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. No, that it did. I mean, it made national news for sure. Maybe even international. We've had a series of storms, and everyone that is in the chat rooms that probably have some Houston folk down there listening, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, it happened that there was at least one image that kind of took off, I think, on Twitter here about a week and a half ago. And then since then, here in the last several days even, I mean, there's been a series of, I think, 1 or 2 different videos that were taken from cars driving kind of down the interstate during these thunderstorms in the evening. And one of them is really interesting looking. I have my own page out on Facebook for the book. It's facebook.com/Lone Star Spooks, and then Lone Star Saucers for this one, this new book. And on the Saucers page, I've been sharing a lot of that and just trying to get people's feedback. Did they see something? What are their thoughts on it? I saw interesting here. I think it was a couple of MUFON investigators had put forward on kind of the most publicized image is just this kind of ring of lights that actually I posted it on the page here the other day. It looks eerily like the UFO on the cover of my book. And I was like, wow, that's interesting that it really does have the same kind of light configuration. But, MUFON, I think, had come out, and I can't remember which investigator it was, had come out and said, we think that could be a reflection of an interstate or a highway exchange, series of lights. You have those long, 5-10 story tall lights that maybe it reflected. If you could see
the look on my face, it's like, really?
Yeah.
Really?
And I mean, one of those, I could see where you could argue it, and it would be hard to say, but no, it's not, without being there. But I think the video, there's one video in particular where it's just kind of at the edge of the supercell. You see these kind of dancing lights, and it's probably 5-6 of them, just kind of whitish blue lights that are kind of appearing, disappearing, just right there in the clouds. And to me, I've lived in Texas my whole life. I've seen a lot of lightning. I haven't even seen ball lightning probably ever in my life. And if I've seen it, it's been maybe once, and I've forgotten since then. So to see these unusual lights in a thunderstorm, knowing I live near Dallas Fort Worth and a international airport, flights are redirected. They're moving out of the way. When they do, they're lined up. They don't really behave in that way. So I think that's an interesting video, and that's one that I know has kind of started up a little bit more buzz. And whatever news station there locally has kind of continued to run with it and say, hey, we haven't gotten a good answer to this. We know the public is interested, and I think that's great. That it's not something that has been ignored. It's been something that the media has kind of taken and run with, and that's a good thing. It gets people talking. Mm-hmm.
No, it is a good thing. And all right, I'm just going to blow my whole question thing. I mean, let's go. I was going to go in this kind of historical manner, but this is just totally blown it. So we're just going to jump, because there was the famous sighting in Stephenville not that long ago.
Yep.
But there weren't any images, were there?
There were actually a few. One, I can't remember who took it, was a kind of a cell phone camera, mobile camera. series of still images or just a video that they kind of cleaned up. That looked much more just kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen I think it was the Verizon commercials, where it's kind of the light, there's a photography trick where you can kind of write with light, in a kind of a 3D space. And it was this unusual kind of, almost like this kind of dancing line of light that was unusual looking. That definitely came out. But you're right, there weren't a lot of really widely publicized videos or images of Stephenville that I think people really associate with the sightings. Mm-hmm. What I think was most interesting about that case, and in the book I interviewed a couple different folks on it that either were witnesses or had researched it after the fact for MUFON, was how widespread it was. The local newspaper and the reporter that really started that story, Angelia Joyner, she had really just printed an initial story. Hey, we'd had several sightings, and a couple of people called in, and I interviewed this one gentleman, posted it, and then the next day they literally just started getting phone calls left and right for a day or two straight. People that normally in that area and within that kind of community wouldn't have reached out about it. And what's interesting is Stephenville's nearby an Air Force base, so they're used to seeing not just commercial but military aircraft in the area. And for so many people to start kind of reaching out and saying, I don't know what it was, I'm not prepared to go on the record, but I saw something and I don't know what it was. I think that was interesting, and what made it stand out that much further were, in my mind, two things. One was that the military, the Air Force, came out and said, hey, we had nothing in the area initially, so we don't know what y'all are talking about, but we didn't have any planes out there. And then as they continued to kind of investigate on their own and continued to get pressure from the media and the public, they finally came out and said, well, hold on, we had several F-16s flying in the area. And that's a little suspicious to say, well, how do you know where those planes, how do you misplace where they were on that evening? And and I think that was one of the gentlemen that was nice enough to be interviewed for the book, Steve Allen. He's a pilot. He's got many hours flying experience, and he said, I know where my dog is right now, and I'm here at the office. It's like, but my dog's at home, in the middle of the den, laying on the rug. And he's like, so to tell me that you don't know where 5+ F-16s, that multi-million-dollar vehicles that have not only pilots but ground support and air traffic control and all these people supporting it, that's dozens, if not hundreds of people that would be involved in any of those taking off at any given time. And to tell me we didn't have any and then, we had several, is suspicious.
Maybe. We're not really 100% sure.
Right. And I think the other part that was interesting was, really, I talked to Robert Powell, who's the director of research for MUFON. He was down there very shortly after these sightings broke, and he was like, if there is real aircraft, then there should be some form of radar data that's out there. Mm-hmm. And again, this is post 9/11 when this took place, and he was able to just request raw radar data from several different points. And then correlated that with eyewitness testimony, and it matched up. And he was able to really build a model, and it's out on YouTube. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's kind of a real-time model that some air traffic controllers helped him kind of put together based on the data that he had collected. And it shows that there is some type of aircraft. It's not commercial. It's not military. It wasn't responding. It didn't have a beacon that said what it was. That was flying in and around kind of the central Texas area for at least an hour, if not longer. They can't say that it's the same one.
Did they send any F-16s or any kind of interceptors after it?
They did. If you think back to W's presidency, George W. Bush had kind of his Texas, White House. And so there's obviously after 9/11, anything flying over our heads that's in the area that we don't know what it is could be conceived as a security threat. And so they went out and kind of looked at all this radar data and said, hey, we see not only the F-16s in the area, but we see commercial traffic in the area. Whatever this is, it's something else. And without having it right in front of me, I mean, they were able to say it's either multiple objects or it's one object moving. And when they start looking at how does it appear in between independent radar hits, it was something that at times was basically hovering, and not moving in any direction, but just hovering still, but would, within 10 seconds would go anywhere upwards of 2,100 miles per hour, and end up, almost in another county. Anything that does that is something that's far beyond what we know publicly as far as what our aircraft and our flight capabilities are. And talking to some of the eyewitnesses and talking to Steve Allen in particular, he was really struck by the fact that whatever this object was, it was something that made no sound, and it was able to move at unheard speeds that if you were a pilot in conventional aircraft, you would have died trying to even make those types of maneuvers. And to me, that makes it that much more interesting.
Well, and it's documented. I mean, I think that's really cool. So what in this Houston one, I mean, let's kind of use that as kind of the primer.
Yeah.
So in this Houston one, did they launch any kind of F-16s? Is there any kind of radar stuff, or is it just way too early to know anything?
I think it's a little early. It was interesting. Anyone that's really started to dig into that, into just UFOs in general and try to get data, Robert Powell, he's anytime sightings come up and he's trying to look for data, he really starts submitting a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests. Hey, I'd like radar data. I'd like to know logs. I'd like to understand if any reports came in, things like that. And you have to be detailed enough to give that agency that you're requesting from, an idea of what you're looking for, right? So if you say, I'm interested in UFO reports on this date, that agency can look at it and say, well, we don't have anything we classified as report. So they just reply back, we don't have anything responsive to your specific request, which is a way of saying we don't have exactly what you worded, but it's not to say that we might not have something else. And I think that's the rub, right? And that's where you say, I would like all air traffic control data for these dates during this, these specific times. And if you have something to look for really specifically, you might be able to get something. But even then, again, with kind of the heightened security that we have here post 9/11, depending on who you're requesting it from, they might not even reply to that response.
That's sad. Any idea about how many people supposedly saw this thing on the ground? I mean, where in Houston was it? Was it over a populated area?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I mean, it was visible from at least the downtown, if not the immediate suburbs of Houston, and just kind of like you, I mean, looking through social media, I mean, it hit CNN.com's homepage, I think Yahoo.com's homepage here in the last week. I mean, it's clearly something that people are interested in, and I think locally there's been a lot of sharing. Hey, did you see that? What was it? And buzz there locally, but same with Stephenville. These types of stories, they don't really take off unless there's something of interest there. Every day someone could hoax a photo. Every day someone could put something kind of, thrown together on YouTube that is convincing enough to get someone's interest. It's something a little bit different, and I think the scale, the magnitude of the sightings and the reports coming in, the questions that start hitting local law enforcement and things like that, those incoming calls and inquiries, those are the things, and especially media outlets, when they start getting the phones ringing and people saying, I saw it, what was it? I want you guys to let me know what that was, or are you doing a story on it? Whenever the media gets pressured, that's when you start seeing these things take off. And so I'd say with Houston, regardless of whatever it is and what it ends up being, determined to be, whatever is put forward as an explanation, it seems to me that locally there has been enough interest generated that the local media outlets have to run with it. And once that happens, you start seeing this kind of feeding frenzy, right? Oh, well, there must be something to it. So now it's a national story, right? And I think that's the key. It builds on itself. And if it had been a non-event and no one had seen it and no one had encountered something unusual or cited something that evening, it would have died instantly. And so I would imagine that there's a multitude of people in and around the area that they saw that, they knew someone that saw it, and they've started making those inquiries, and it's gained legs as a result.
Yeah, and not just one person, because if it was just one person, then they'd be like, that's that crackpot.
Yeah,
Drinking
exactly.
too much bourbon.
Exactly. Well, and it's funny, and we're talking about it in the context that it is a UFO. What's interesting, and in the book, to me, my publisher at the time, my editor had sent me an email and said, "Would you be interested in writing this book?" And I was like, "I don't know. I'll have to a little bit about it." And my wife is very much the skeptic in our household. She's like, "I don't know how much of this I really believe in. So good luck. I believe in you, and good luck writing the book, but I don't know about it." And I went home that night, and it was February evening, so still kind of cold. The sun set early, and right here outside of downtown Dallas is kind of where we're in and around. And I was walking the dog and came up on our one of our neighbors, and he said, "Did you just see this massive light fall out of the sky by the airport?" And I was like, no, I just walking the dog and checking my email on the phone. No, I didn't see it. And he goes, it looked like a plane fell out of the sky. And I was like, oh God, that's terrible. Like, I'm sure we'll hear sirens or something because we're only a couple of miles even from the airport here. And he's like, no, I saw it. I don't know what it was, but I figured you'd seen it. I mean, it would have been hard to miss. And I was like, no, I didn't. Well, thanks a lot. And kept walking, and my phone rang, and my wife's sitting in traffic, and she goes, I saw an airplane fall out of the sky by the airport. And it's like, what are you talking about? And she said, no, all these people are just stopped here looking at me. People were pointing out of their cars at, what they just saw. And it's this green, glowing, massive object that just appeared over the airport and dropped straight down. And everyone here in the DFW area started turning to Facebook and Twitter. The newscasts that evening instantly jumped on the story. Hey, we're getting reports of bizarre lights and crashed objects in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And it turned out that it was Aurora Borealis that no one really sees this far south that was able to be seen that time of year with those weather conditions. But it really drove the whole area into this instant awareness that something's happening overhead and no one has seen this before. And I think that's important for people to remember. And in the book, I try to drive that home, that it doesn't have to be aliens. It doesn't have to be secret government craft. If you are able to say and accept there are unusual things that people are not accustomed to seeing in life, that come up from time to time that warrant us looking into them and further investigation. That's the key point. I think it's hard for skeptics to really deny it, and I think for believers it's to say start there. We'll worry about if they're from Andromeda or a different dimension later. It's what is there really something unusual here?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, we're going to shift gears again because I want to get back because there were a couple of questions in the chat room before I abruptly changed the topic. Because I kind of got a little excited. But we were talking about old sightings in Texas, and probably one of the ones that have gotten the most coverage is the one in Aurora. And I don't think, everyone's familiar with that case. And I find it very interesting. Just, there's the details of the case, but then there's, how early it is in history. So I'm just going to give you the mic. And if you could just, kind of start at the beginning and just share that story with people.
Sure. Well, we touched on it a little earlier. In 1897, I mean, there was a series of UFO sightings, or airship sightings as they were described back then, that really started kind of in the Sacramento area and started moving eastward. And in Texas, these airship and just UFO sightings in general really started kind of in the April-May timeframe. And, you're getting reports from North Texas. You're getting them as far south kind of as the Galveston area, San Antonio, and everywhere in between. And when you look back, as we kind of mentioned, the newspapers of the day, the editors of the day, they really wanted to drive readership. Stories like that were outlandish or much, probably much more colorful to cover, and probably garnered a lot more interest and just buzz than, here's what the weather did yesterday, or, someone put down a cow, that sort of story. And so, there really was a series of, I would say dozens of articles across several newspapers, I specifically, found a lot of great info from old Dallas Morning News articles, but there were others, again, throughout the state that covered this. And one of them was in Aurora, Texas, which is not far outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. And it was really kind of a short story. There was a writer out there, S.E. Hayden, and he had written this story about a craft, a metallic-looking craft that had flown overhead that morning or early afternoon. And kind of looked like it had been in some type of distress, right? So it was, kind of behaving erratically. Seems like it had, either been on fire or was smoking. Flew over the town, hit Judge Proctor's windmill, and crashed and, scattered into just this, ton of debris, just a lot of, little aluminum metallic-looking objects. And the way it was written was that, hey, after this crash happened, locals ran over and they found this diminutive little spaceman, and that he had on him these papers or these metallic kind of little objects that had what he described as kind of hieroglyphic or unusual writing on it. And he ended it with there's going to be a service, and the poor spaceman is going to be buried in the local cemetery, and that'll take place. And there you go. And that was the end of the story. And at the time, it really didn't spur a lot of interest. I mean, even when you look back through all those archives, I don't remember seeing even another article about it. The Dallas Morning News picked it up, but it had been written locally in Wise County. And so what was unusual about it is that it was really starting to get picked up kind of in the 1970s, when people said, remember back when there was this unusual article that was written. And it turns out that it started generating more and more interest. You had kind of the Close Encounters of the Third Kind film was starting to come up. I think there was an awareness after Roswell. The 50s had a few different flaps. And so, people were a little more primed for this idea of spaceships and aliens. And so during that time, there were on-site investigations. There was a lot of I would say not criminal, but just trespassing in and around this very small town's local cemetery looking for the body of this alien. And supposedly there had been a marker that had been left there that had crudely had kind of a spacecraft or a cigar-shaped object with portals kind of carved into it as the headstone for this gravesite. And whenever this initial kind of excavation was being planned, it turned out that in the middle of the night, someone had broken in and they had vandalized this particular grave. They had inserted a 2 to 3 inch thick pipe down into the grave and seemed to have extracted whatever may have been in there. And due to this, the local officials at the time said, we're going to shut this down. No one else is allowed in. They had law enforcement kind of guarding the cemetery, during the evenings and, just patrolling it regularly to make sure people kind of stayed out and, hey, we don't want to attract that to this town and we're done with this whole UFO flap. And the UFO Hunters show here, even a few years ago, went back to Aurora and were able to interview locals, really do a good survey of kind of the area. And it's interesting. I mean, there's some unusual things, looking into it. And as I wrote about it in the book, I think a lot of it is there are some unusual elements of the story. It does appear that there was a family, the Oates family, that lived on that property here in the 1900s. They did seem to have some type of potential deformities that may or may not have been related to groundwater, well water at the time, where there was kind of goiters and some of these unusual kind of growths that a couple of the family members had experienced. But here, even in the early 2000s, really looking at the excavation, looking at the the scientific data that they were able to bring back, nothing really conclusively has come of it. We haven't found the body of a little alien. We haven't seen anything other than trace elements of aluminum and things like that were actually found deep within this well years later. And as I went back and went to the historical museum in Wise County and worked with the ladies there and went through their archives, I came across a great book written in the mid 1970s by a local from Aurora. Her name's Etta Peegs. And Etta really wrote a nice book just about the history of Aurora, Texas, and a big part of that book, including some really neat drawings that she had done at the time there, were of this spaceship crash and the story around it. And at the time, she'd interviewed a lot of folks that they were children at the time. They lived in the area on the date that it was supposed to have happened. And most of those said that they didn't recall that event taking place. They don't remember that it was something, made up at the time by S.E. Hayden. And that's, a lot of people go, well, that's easy to say, but that silences the people who really do know what happened. And as I kind of went back and started looking, you read the history of the town. There was a massive fire not long before this event that really decimated a large part of the town. They were really looking forward to tourism and increased trade due to an incoming railroad, which ultimately did not come out to Aurora, which set the town back quite a bit economically. They had a boll weevil infestation that really killed and decimated a lot of the crops. They had yellow fever. There's just a lot of things, a lot of challenges at the time that really were making it difficult for anyone to stay in town, let alone come to the town and help thrive. And a lot just speculate that, hey, he was a writer, he was a poet, he had some free space, he wrote this story, the airship was on everyone's mind, and he thought this would be a great way to attract tourists to the town. And I think ultimately that might be the answer to this story in light of, harder evidence. But it is a great story. It's a story that's endured, and I think that's a great Texas folk tale. If anything, it captures people's imagination. It forces them to go back into history to find out what's happened in the state. And if they end up making the decision, hey, I agree with Nate, I don't think there's much to it, and it makes sense why this would have been written at the time, that's great. And others are feel to think, hey, there was a poor little spaceman that he was removed in the middle of the night in the 1970s, and now he's in a frozen locker somewhere. That could just as easily have happened as well. But I think it's still a great tall Texas tale, and it's one that it survives certainly the author and for generations since. And there's still a headstone out there that's been replaced since that has a little similar etching of this UFO with little portholes, and people that come out to visit the cemetery leave little pennies on it, I think, contribute of the story and the idea behind it. And I think it's just a great story. It's a great Texas tale.
But when did the Wrights fly their plane?
So the early 1900s. So this would have definitely predated.
Mm-hmm. So for this guy to make this whole story up,
yep,
it would be a pretty tall tale.
Yeah, and what's interesting though is, again, when we think of UFO sightings today, a lot of people say, like Houston is a perfect example. Someone caught an image that sparked some ideas. I'm sure somebody else, they have their video of it from their cell phone. But I'm almost certain someone decided, hey, I'm going to start lighting off Chinese lanterns this week and see if I can drive more interest and hysteria. I think at the time, there have been several days, a couple of weeks where these reports were commonplace, and then even farther west, for a few months, the story had started to gain kind of national attention. And I think it was one of those, hey, I already know what people are writing about. They're writing about airships. What would be more impressive than that? It would be if one crashed and it had a spaceman on it. And it's that, to your point, it's how can I make this more over the top? How can I make this one stand out? And what's unusual to me is when you read that story, it's got a great narrative, but it succinctly wraps the story up in we buried him and not that it flew away. And a lot of the other stories, especially in the Dallas area, where millions of people, at the time that's probably exaggerated, but 1 million people in Dallas all saw this on this evening. And that to me is still a much bigger story. Is it hard to prove it? Yes, it's hard. We don't have any photos of that event. But when you make a claim in the major newspaper, and send out to all your readers that all these people saw it, something had to have happened. Now, whether it was a comet or something else, or if it was truly a UFO, that's up for debate. But I think this one, it's a much smaller town. It's outside of town. It was from kind of more of an unknown or only locally known writer. And it was a town that was facing a lot of financial and just, challenges for its citizens in general. And I think that's where it's, hey, let's go for broke and let's see if we can turn this around. And to me, that's a likely story. It's a little more bittersweet but it's definitely something that, like you said, when people think of airship stories, the first one they think of is that one. And so the way it's written, he definitely, whether it really happened or not, he had details in there that even 100 years later kept people scratching their heads and going, we got to get to the bottom of this one.
Yeah. I mean, I just find that one, well, I've been to that cemetery, so that was kind of cool.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, it's a quaint little cemetery. I mean, it's out there on its own,
out in the middle of nowhere, making you go, "Wow!" If this really happened, it makes you wonder what they were thinking about the whole thing.
Oh, I know, yeah.
But
I think another interesting at the time is a lot of the stories that you read, and a lot of them I came across were that the pilots of these airships were people. They spoke English just like you and me. They didn't have an eye in their forehead. They weren't green. They didn't have phasers. They weren't walking around with iPhones or these high-tech communicators. They looked like men, and they spoke English. And in some of the stories, these airships flew over town, and they dropped a bottle with a message in it, written in handwritten in English that said, "We've flown all over your country, and this city is by far the most beautiful part of Texas." And you just have to wonder if that mayor, wasn't really trying for some sort of, kind of city council, shot in the arm or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Those are kind of interesting. There's another one. Speaking of Houston, there's a great story and a great article I put in the book too about a Mr. Barclay, who during that same period of time saw this airship at night land in a field on his property, lights ablaze and everything, and he ran out to the field to see what was going on. And halfway, coming up on it, he was, encountered by a man that said, "Hey, we need, a couple of different materials, and we're going to give you money to go round all that up, and we're going to fix this ship, and thanks a lot." And so he handed him money, and he ran off and gathered up, some of these different items. He came back and said, "Here you go. I'd love to see, your craft there." And he said, "Well, I can't show it to you, but thanks for your help." And started to walk away. And this Mr. Barclay said, "Well, where are you from?" And he said, "We're from nowhere, but we'll be in Greece the day after tomorrow." And the way that story was written, you start thinking, well, how did they, what is that? We're from nowhere. That's very cryptic. And
Mm-hmm.
how do they have cash on them if they're intergalactic? They just happen to have dollar bills. How do they speak English? How do they know to request
They went
these
to the
local
ATM.
things and interact with this man? Yeah, I mean, they just knew. And you think of a story like that and you go, there's so much wrong with it. If you're a skeptic, you can just poke holes in it all day. But it's amazing that someone just reported it and then wrote it, and that 100 years later, people still are going, I'm not sure what happened then, because we have this predisposition, I think, to look back on history as it's exactly the way we're reading it, that it never changed at all. Everyone back then was genuine, and they're writing exactly as it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a challenge, and it's a challenge today. And I think it's an important lens, though, to filter it all through.
So based on your research, are there any hot spots in the state?
I haven't. I've looked and I've talked to several different people. I don't know if there are hot spots. I think there's certainly waves that seem to happen over time. You go back to the 50s, and there were the Lubbock Light sightings, the Stephenville sightings in the 2000s. There was the Cash Landrum incident back in the early 80s. So it does seem that let's call it 10, every 20 years, that there's a significant series of sightings or a significant event in Texas where multiple people are involved and see it. As far as where are the best places to see it, it definitely seems that outside of the more populated cities, it's easier just to get away from the ambient city light, and you see a much clearer sky, a darker sky. There's less, air traffic. There's less satellites, maybe, or at least where to kind of look at them. I mean, you can have apps today that you can hold your iPad up and go, "Oh, that's just a satellite," or "Oh, that's that constellation or that star." So I think it's getting outside and looking up. And that's the other thing. It's usually around sunset, early evening, that people seem to have sightings, and a lot of the time it's just because they're looking at the evening sky. They're taking that in and going, "Oh, it's a beautiful sunset," and that's when they notice something unusual. And I asked that. It was a couple different folks talking to them in the course of writing the book. It's like, why don't people report this more? And they said, think about let's go back to the 1890s. What did people do in the evenings? They couldn't be out on the farm. It was too dark. They didn't really have a lot of other entertainment. They were out there looking at the moon. They were talking. They were enjoying the evening. And today, everyone's very compartmentalized. You're in your house, you get out of your house, you go and get into your car. You get in your car, you go to the parking garage, you get out of that, and you go into the office or the mall. But you're not looking up a lot anymore, and people aren't very aware of that. And particularly when you're in the city or around an airport, you're so used to airplanes that eventually you just drown the noise out and you stop looking. You just assume that whatever's in the sky is supposed to be there. And I think that's a lot of it. So when people do see things, typically it is like early in the morning, right around sunset or early evening. And then again, it's usually when they're outside of kind of larger cities where it's easier to kind of see for far distances, and it's easier, to kind of have a darker evening sky.
Well, I think one of the things that is good on the pro side is that everybody's got a cell phone. And, it's just up to everybody to remember, shoot the picture. Shoot the picture.
And it's funny, and I asked that question, as any skeptical reader is going to go, why didn't you ask that question? So I made sure to ask that question, and I said, okay, Robert Powell, you see all of these different MUFON submitted reports and sightings. You see all of these, firsthand eyewitness accounts. You've talked to these people, and we never see the great photo, right? He said, a lot of that is the photos that we have on our phones or the cameras on our phones. They're not that great. If you're trying to catch something that's 50 yards in front of you, maybe it's great. If it's plain as day, it's as big as the side of a house and it's right there, he's like, that camera on your iPhone is going to work. If it's something that it's, 2,000 feet up and it's moving at 200 miles an hour, good luck catching it with that phone. You're probably not going to do it. He said, and the other part is when you genuinely have a sighting, and Steve Allen, he saw in his case, the UFO in Stephenville that he reported, he saw it 2 times in the same evening. And he said, the first time I saw it, it literally took my brain several moments to even comprehend what I was seeing. He's like, I really started, when I saw it, my first thought is I must be hallucinating or I'm going crazy. My brain wouldn't, I couldn't admit to myself that this was actually something taking place. And even on second viewing, when he saw it again, pass over another time, he said even then I was still in awe of this. My brain was trying to understand it. He's like, but then I immediately started having a reaction of, what does this mean? Is this a positive or a negative thing? Is this thing about to, shoot some beam down and just destroy the entire town? Or, there's F-16s right behind it. Why are they chasing it if it's something friendly? That concerned him at the time. And that's what a lot of people will say. It's like you're so taken aback in the moment, and usually the sightings are so brief that you don't even have a chance to react to it. You just, and after the fact, you're like, oh my God, I should have taken a picture. But you're probably still in such a state of shock if it really is a genuine, impressive sighting like that most people, they don't have that equipment on them. And if they do, it's a phone. And by the time it's over, and they've, realized what happened, it's already happened.
And on that note, Nate, we need to call it a wrap because the music's going to be coming up. You have been a pleasure to have on the show, so I can't wait till your next book comes out so I can have you back.
Yes, well, I'd love to. Well, thank you so much, Rita, for having me, and thanks to everyone listening tonight.
Your book, I'm assuming Amazon.com, all the regular outlets, people can get it? Yep, and if Amazon, they want an autograph copy, is that possible?
They can follow Facebook.com/Lone Star Saucers. They can feel free to put a comment up there, and feel free to reach out to me on Facebook, and I'd be happy to get them hooked up however I can.
Perfect. Nate, thank you so much, and I'm going to let you go. You have a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you again soon.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Rita.
Oh, you're welcome. That's
Bye-bye.
Nate Riddle. His webpage, well, we won't say his webpage because it's not really working. His book is Lone Star Saucers, Searching for UFOs in Texas. And then next week, we have A.R. Roberts coming on talking about the anatomy of UFO phenomena. And in the second hour, we have Ken Elliott talking about revolutionized manifesting. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio.